This is the Segovia Show.
I remember what I felt watching what appeared to be just a bunch of military-age males running in desperation to get on any flight out of the Kabul airport, instead of standing up to resist the Taliban. The Taliban rolled in seemingly without any resistance, and I kept asking myself, what was the point? What happened to all the training, all the sacrifices, the $2 trillion tax bill, over 6,000 American dead? Why? And after taking time to cool off and wanting to look into this, because the media never really covers the whole story, gave me different perspective into something I didn't know. Then a film called The Covenant came out that added even more context for why some in the veteran community felt our betrayal to our allies. More recently, I found out about Lieutenant General Sami Sadat. And the more I looked into his story, the more I found it incredible as I read his book, The Last Commander. I quickly learned there's a documentary called Retrograde by Cartel and director that came out 2 years ago for National Geographic.
I just don't believe that the Americans are going to retrograde and leave the country. I want to live long enough to see peace in our country, grow old in Afghanistan, and ultimately die in Afghanistan.
Unfortunately, some of the faces were not blurred for some of the American allies, and the Taliban used the film as a hit list to deadly results. And while politicians will throw shade left and right, blaming one or the other, I needed to hear from an Afghan and find out what actually happened, because no one seems to be covering their side of the story. What policies, if any, had any effect in their ability to resist the enemy? And what I found disturbed me because it contradicted what I believed in what I saw with the images coming out of Kabul. This is my conversation with Lieutenant General Sami Sadat. I'd like to welcome onto the Segovia Show, General Sami Sadat. General, this is a unique opportunity, and thank you for being here on the Segovia Show.
Thank you, Andres. I'm very happy to be on your show for today.
Excellent, sir. And I might have introduced a little bit about you to the audience in the intro, but just to hear it from you yourself, you're currently the chairman, we've seen the tagline of the Afghanistan United Front. But can you tell us what you're best known for, your reputation in Afghanistan?
In my country, I'm known as a military officer. I was commanding the Afghan Joint Special Operation Command, and I was also commanding later the Afghan Army's 215 Army Corps in southwestern Afghanistan. And then just before the fall, I was appointed as commander of the Afghanistan National Special Operation Corps. And I'm known as a soldier more than as a politician, but I'm starting to be known as a politician. Unfortunately, I had to delve into politics due to the circumstances. And our organization, Afghanistan United Front, is a political organization, and its main objective is to return Afghanistan into a constitutional order, thereby freeing our country from the Taliban and establishing a constitutional order whereby people can choose their leaders and Afghans can live freely.
I see. And I do have some questions about the Afghanistan United Front, but I think I'm going to save it for after we talk a little bit about you yourself and what went down in Afghanistan. But before anything else, folks, General Sadat just released his new book, The Last Commander. The Last Commander, The Once and Future Battle for Afghanistan. I got this from Amazon. I believe it's also generally available. Do you know if it's just on Amazon right now, on print?
As far as I know, it's just on Amazon, but it could be on other platforms.
And that's a great opportunity to know about your story. I wanted to ask for a little bit of clarity for myself and for the audience that doesn't know about this. Can you tell us what the NDS stood for? Because it looks like that's what you spent your early years doing.
Yes, NDS was the premier Afghan intelligence agency. So before I joined the army, I was an intelligence officer. I worked in the intelligence department, and particularly the highlights of my career was I was director of Covert Action Program. Covert Action Program is basically working behind the enemy lines and from eliminating targets to, targeting their psychology and mindset and, creating all sorts of kinds of trouble for the enemy behind the enemy lines. And later in the intelligence department in 2016, I took over a joint counterterrorism unit, which was a U.S.-Afghan joint counterterrorism unit. And I led that for 2 years. The job of that counterterrorism, particularly going after international terrorism in Afghanistan, which was primarily Al-Qaeda, but also ISIS. And in our they call themselves Islamic State in Khorasan province, so basically ISKP.
Yeah, oh, my goodness. As a, I don't know if I mentioned this, I didn't serve. I'm just the average American that funds these things. And when I hear these things, at first it seems like, well, aren't they all the same thing? But they're technically not. As reading your book, I was understanding some about the tribalism in Afghanistan. But it also sounds like that tribalism extends to terror groups, because you just mentioned 3, and even some of them what we most famously know as ISIS, but then ISKP. It's like, these are all different organizations that don't get along? Is that it?
That's right. So there is the big ones you need to know is Taliban, Al Qaeda, and ISIS. So ISIS, the base in Iraq and Syria, they know themselves as ISIS, but their out branch in South Central Asia, which is, the capital is Afghanistan, they call themselves ISIS in Khorasan province. Khorasan is a historic name for Afghanistan region, which encompassed half of Iran, Central Asia, Pakistan, all the way to India. This used to be a large Afghan empire hundreds of years ago, and the area was known as Khorasan. So ISIS calls it the Khorasan province, and now today as we speak, the most prominent and the most capable ISIS out branch in the world is ISKP, which is Islamic State in Khorasan province. They are opposing the Taliban, and the Taliban are opposing them. So between themselves, they have trouble. Although their ideology is founded on the basics of, tyranny and fanatical religious extremism. However, their methods are somewhat different, and they compete for power in different geographies. Al-Qaeda is more affiliated with Taliban. Al-Qaeda basically serves the Taliban, and Al-Qaeda pledges allegiance to the Taliban leadership. So Al-Qaeda and Taliban are one party, and then ISIS is separate, and they both hate each other.
It's fascinating to learn more about that, because to a lot of Americans that unfortunately woke up that Tuesday morning, September 11, 2001, and saw the towers fall, to a lot of them was the first time hearing about Al-Qaeda, but terrorism is nothing new. I believe the day we're recording this, I could be wrong, but it's the anniversary of the Marine barracks bombing in Beirut, Lebanon. That and the first terror attack against the World Trade Center in 1993, a couple of our embassies in Africa being targeted, the USS Cole. That's just recent memory in my lifetime of terror attacks. But to a lot of Americans, they only associate it with September 11, 2001. And that's what launched us into what is called as America's longest war, the one in Afghanistan. And a lot of Americans were even asking, why are we there instead of being in Saudi Arabia? If they were Saudis, there's a lot of nuances to that. But I did have Sarah Adams and Dave Boone Benton on the show to address just that in a recent episode. Because I'm still learning about some of these things too. But in understanding Afghanistan, since we spent the most time there, in what you describe as your job in intelligence before moving up the ranks and in other departments. So the NDS was kind of like our version of the CIA. Was that it?
That's right. Yeah, it was the Afghan CIA.
And that was, as I recall from your book, when you were entered the spy games, if you will, that was under, was it Karzai? President Karzai?
That's right. I think it was 2013 when we started. Yeah, it was President Karzai's presidency ended at the end of 2014, I want to say.
Because then there was an administration change, and of course politics comes with it. And in bringing up some tribalism, when was it that you were kind of tasked to try to bridge a gap with the elders of different provinces? Because as I learned so much, it's technically if one of these elders of this province or a tribal area, if they tell the group, all right, let's work with them, they'll do it. Or if they don't work with them, they'll go somewhere else. It seems like that was a recurring theme. Was that during your time during intelligence or when you were working with the special ops community?
Yeah, it was during intelligence. So covert action program is basically promoting your own government, your own forces, your own ideas, but discrediting those of your enemies. And one of the key influencers, so we basically identified 4 categories of people who can influence the Afghan community. And on the top of the list are the tribal chiefs. So the tribal chiefs, because they live in the villages with the people, they usually attend to people's problems, and they're like leaders and community leaders and problem solvers. So they have a lot of influence on the way the community lives. So one of our key target was to influence them so they can influence the society. The other one was the religious leaders, like people who, are needing prayers and all that. It was a very important thing. We've been trying to influence them to preach against terrorism and preach against young people, discourage them not to join the terrorism, but instead encourage them to join the Afghan military and the Afghan government. The fourth one was the civil society. The civil society has developed dramatically in our country. And in 20 years of the Republic with the U.S. presence, our society has completely transformed into an isolated, self-facing society, into outwards and a transformative society with great liberal and civic ideas. So this civil society became a key influencer. And the fourth one, of course, was media. Media also became an important element of our society in 20 years of our freedom. So you would want to, 4 of the pillars, you would want to have influence in all 4 of them and have the leadership of these 4 communities on your side in order to promote, government agendas and ideas. Effectively, I was only allowed to use these 4 communities in the matter of terrorism, against terrorism and in favor of our government. In terms of other politics, like swaying elections or, setting up agendas for larger society in politics, we were not allowed to do that. So covert action is a very powerful tool, and there's a lot of regulations that comes along with that. And so we had to adhere to those rules and regulations as well. I would say we were very successful in influencing some of the tribal regions. And as you read in the book, and you can see the news in Pakistan as well, there's a lot of uprising, a lot of young men and women are now on the streets. They're demanding more rights. They're refusing terrorism. And they had a grand jirga in Waziristan a couple of days ago, whereby 30,000, Pashtun men and women came together, and they have announced that we don't want to allow the Tehrik-e-Taliban in Pakistan, which is a terrorist organization over there, to come and operate in our communities. And they also asked the Pakistani army to stop, military operations in the villages and in the houses. So these are good news. There is an enlightenment happening in that region. And this is all because of the great work that was happening in Afghanistan across different pillars, but most definitely in awakening the society and transforming our society into, learning more and in a more liberal view of the world.
Yeah, that is good to hear. That the seeds of freedom were planted there, and people are exercising that freedom. It seems against a tyrannical government, so that in the face of those threats, sometimes Americans here can feel like, oh my goodness, they're killing me. It's like, why? Because they blocked my Facebook. Come on. People have a way with words to be over the top, but hearing that is amazing to know. That's good, because the next generation have to carry the load. There is a story that you mentioned that I have to bring up, and it's with respects to you going to these tribal leaders. It was a meeting with one of the tribal leaders, but I think it was truncated because there was a miscommunication with the I think it was United States Air Force or someone that was targeting this tribal leader as you try to meet him, and it was called off, and you were able to arrange it again. But this time he came with suicide bombers as backup in case you were the one trying to take him out. Can you tell us that story? Because I need to hear it from you.
Yeah, so this was not a tribal leader. This was a
terrorist. A terrorist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we needed to recruit him because he had vital information about other terrorists. He agreed to meet with us, and then I went one night out close to the Pakistani border as he was crossing over to meet with me. As soon as he crossed, then the U.S. Air Force took a shot at him, and they hit one of the vehicles, and I thought he's been killed. And I called back, some of my contacts in the U.S. government. I was like, what the heck are you guys doing? Are you trying to kill me as well? Because this was my guy, I wanted to recruit him and use him for information. They're like, well, the CIA knew I was there, but the U.S. Air Force didn't know. And the CIA contact told me, like, well, we can't tell everything to the U.S. Air Force. And I got very worried. I'm like, did you tell them that I'm here not to shoot? The rocket landed like very close to where I was.
Wow.
And so that was a horrible night, and we were driving back to the base. And then as soon as we arrived in the base, we got a phone call from the same guy that he's alive. He was not in the front car, he was in the back car, and 2 of his guys are dead and 2 others are injured. He said that what happened, and then we had to explain that it was not our fault, it was the Americans, and we couldn't do more coordination because we needed to see you in secret and all that. And he said that, okay, if you're saying the truth, then you have to treat our wounded comrades. And I said, sure. So we brought their wounded man and treated, and then we paid for their death, bit of a penalty. And then 2 days later, we called the guy again. It's like, do you want to meet? And he said yes. And then he turns out the next day on the top of a hill where we are, like hundreds of kilometers away from our base in Barmal district of Paktika, he comes up with suicide bombers with him. And then, our guys wanted to shoot him, and the suicide bombers, they said like, well, we just killed 2 of his guys 2 days ago, and he's probably trying to reach out to you and then blow himself up. But I knew I had two of his guys injured in our base, and then I also knew that he was desperate, to get his name off the hit list. And I was also desperate because our city of Kabul, the capital city, was getting bombed every single day. There was car bomb after car bomb after car bomb. And I knew this guy can help us stop a lot of those car bombs because he has vital intelligence. So I took the risk of meeting him anyway. And then we sit down on top of a hill with him and his suicide bombers and with my guys and snipers, just pointing at the heads of every suicide bomber and everybody sitting there. It was how do I say? It was very so your adrenaline is flying through your head. I mean, your heart goes like probably 150 times per minute. And I'm talking, and I'm also paying attention to the suicide bomber. And one of them was a little bit heavy, chubby guy, and he almost fell asleep. And I was like, whoa, tell him not to fall asleep because accidentally he can push the button, and then we're all dead. It was funny, but for some reason, as we went on to the meeting and discussed, I felt comfortable knowing that there is a reason for him not to blow up, because the first 10 minutes is extremely important. That if they wanted to kill you, they would kill you immediately because they cannot that long. But after that, I became a little bit more comfortable, and we had the meeting. We ended up recruiting this guy, and he provided a lot of good information. Based on his information, we avoided a lot of truck bombs driving into our cities, and we probably saved 1,000 guys. If I didn't take the risk that night, we would probably got hit even harder and stronger by the Haqqani network. So, I'm glad I took that risk, but it was a difficult choice to make.
I'm sure. I mean, normally when I hear reports about suicide bombers, it's just the one, but there were more than one just to meet with you guys? Wow, that's too many moving parts, honestly. So that's incredible. And to give context to the people hearing this for the first time, this was several years after, unfortunately, your mentor was killed by a suicide bomber at a meeting. This individual was checked, right? They checked him from neck to toe, but they didn't check. Was it turban? Was that it?
That's right. Yeah.
We as Americans that don't understand the cultural importance of certain clothing and things, is the head covering something that you just don't mess with on a person? Is that it?
It is a little bit disrespectful to remove somebody's turban, but in personality like Professor Rabbani or the president, it would have been normal for people to remove the turban and check it. However, the bomb that killed Professor Rabbani, the former president of Afghanistan, was so small that it fitted in the lining of a hat. They use these little round hats. So it was in the lining of the hat, and on top of the hat was the turban.
Oh, my goodness.
Finding it was really, really very small. Even if they remove the turban, they usually just check the turban, remove it, and put it back. They could blew it off probably, but they wouldn't have been able to find it. As Professor Rabbani greeted this Taliban guy, and this Taliban guy was supposed to bring the peace message from the Taliban side, and Professor was very happy to receive him. And as soon as he greeted the guy, he blew up his turban and then killed Professor Rabbani. This is back in 2011. Mm-hmm. And the meeting I conducted, with this guy was in 2016, exactly five years after that incident. A lot of the Taliban used suicide bombers dressed as a good guy. They would come, and as soon as they reached their targets, they would blow themselves up and kill the target or kill several other people. The same thing happened in a CIA base in Khost, in Camp Salerno, where Jordanian source came, wearing a bomb and then blew up CIA officers and killed them. This was a very similar case. However, got lucky and they didn't blow themselves up. So we walked away.
Yeah,
all right.
I mean, that's crazy. Well, unfortunate events, but even knowing all that, to still take that chance. I'm flipping through your book and I'm like, dude, where did they find you? Seriously.
Yeah, sometimes it is circumstances that builds you into, a situation whereby normally you wouldn't do things, but as the pressure of the environment builds in you from very childhood, you need to toughen up, you need to grow, you need to learn, you need to deploy a new tactic. Then you learn this, and then in the line of the mission, sometimes you have to do things that are absolutely crazy. But if you want to succeed, if you really want to succeed, that's what you have to do. Remember the question that people often ask, like, how bad you want it? Mm-hmm. So if you really want things, it depends how bad you want things to be done. So then you would, take those risks. And usually those risks work in your favor and the mission is achieved. Oftentimes, if they don't work, then that's the end of it as well. So there's a bit of a balance you have to calculate, but there is oftentimes you have to take the risk. And turns out it's not that bad after you finish it. You're like, okay, that's...
What inspired you to serve your country the way you did?
To be honest, it was the Taliban's brutality in the late 1990s when I saw them and they were beating and torturing and hanging people. And I thought I was a kid, and I wrote in the book, in The Last Commander, that they put me in prison when I was 14 years old. Mm-hmm. In prison, they were beating these little children. So this was a minors' prison, and they were brutally beating and torturing kids. And one of the kids died under torture. And the next day, instead of the Taliban being apologetic for it, they came up, rounded all of us up, and then they were explaining that this kid was a sinner, and therefore he's dead now, so you don't have to be a sinner. And I immediately knew, like, this is not right. You killed the kid, you have no remorse, you have no responsibility, and you're saying that the rest of you are sinful as well. If you die, you'll just die like a piece of, wood. And that day I decided, like, you know what, when I go out, I'm going to become a warrior, and I'm going to go after the Taliban and kill them, because they're awful people. They're even killing children and women and men and all that. And when I got released from the prison, I believe it was 2001. I can't remember what month it was, but it was, I think, the months of the fall. And immediately, I think 2-3 months later, 9/11 happened. So then the Taliban fall apart. My father was fighting in the north with the resistance. When he came up, and then his soldiers were all dressed up and they had uniforms and they were very respectful and they were nice, not beating people, helping everybody. And they had a squad and unit and respect. And I was like, whoa, okay, I want to be a soldier. This is nice. Yeah. So then I ended up becoming a soldier, and I served in the Afghan intelligence, in the Afghan army, in the Afghan special operations. I partnered with U.S. forces, and I learned a lot from the U.S. forces, but also I learned a lot in Afghan military and going into the villages for the operations, as I noted some of the encounters I had in the community in suburbs of, outside the main cities. I learned a lot from our own people, tribal leaders and their customs, and the food is amazing. And so, yeah, then I'm a lifetime learner. I keep my mind open. I learn every day. I learn from you, from the guy on the street, or if I have a discussion and I hear a good idea, I just try to memorize it and then use it in my life. So that's been a blessing. And I signed up for fighting for our country. Unfortunately, the circumstances changed against us, but we are still willing to stand up and fight again.
Yeah. And to some of those circumstances, I want to clarify for the people. I do need to touch on this because I'm sure that people were a little jealous of your age, because one of the recurring themes in your book was, who is this young guy? And I'm sure that made you some enemies in the government.
Oh, it did, Andres. And some of our older guard, like some of the officers, they were not very happy with me moving through the ranks a little bit rapidly, but not as rapidly. And some people questioned and criticized, even in the national media, that why I became a general officer in a very young age. Mm-hmm. It was not political. I was always on the battlefield, in the forefront of fighting. And whenever everything else failed against a Taliban advancement, or against an area where the Taliban would take it over, or there was a target that nobody could find, and they would deploy me, and I would, collapse the enemy line and find a target and finish them off. And I didn't care how long it took. If I was deployed for 2 days, sometimes I spent a month, because the mission was not achieved. I wouldn't go back with my guys. And then my guys had the same mindset like me. Whenever we were deployed there, we would absolutely, move any rock, touch anything, and go to anybody to make sure that we succeed. So this kind of helped me grow a lot faster than some of the other officers that wouldn't take the same risks or wouldn't deploy the same tactics. I think I'm extremely lucky that I have a mindset of finding people, capable people, passionate people, and then working with them as a team. And I'm not an individualist, and I hate it when I want something for myself only. For me, it's all about the team. And then once you get the right team, the strong, capable people like your own self, then, this energy kind of blossoms, and you can do anything absolutely you want. It's true in the military, it's true in business, it's true in networking, in banking, in whatever you may want to call it. Sometimes it's not easy to work in a team because there's different moods and different personalities. But slowly, if you filter it, and then you get the same like-minded people, and then it becomes easier, and it becomes a great support element. People who are frustrated, or they have hypertension, they want to be alone, they want to leave me alone, I want to be on myself. But then if you want to live alone on your happy time, be sure that you will be left alone on your grief time as well, because nobody gives a crap about you when you're moody and tired and you come to your friends. But if you're partying, you go somewhere else, and it doesn't work. There's a book I read a long time ago, and I really loved it. And I strongly suggest, Andres, if you have, it seems you're a book reader. It's called My Vision. It's written by the ruler of Dubai, Sheikh Mohammed, and he's talking about leadership and vision. And one of the things that really resonated well with me was that you take care of your people, and they will take care of you when you need them. So, it is very true. If you take care of your man, your friends, your family when they need you, they will absolutely take care of you when you need them. So I think it's an important lesson that you cannot rely on somebody if he or she cannot rely on you. So it's a two-way thing. And I've always been lucky to have a good family and good friends, and I still am very lucky to have a great team, good friends, and life becomes easier even in the most difficult circumstances.
Yeah, and I'm glad you say it that way. And we don't have a chance to get into some of those stories, but for people that to get a better grasp, because unfortunately there's no access right now to the film Retrograde, because the filmmakers didn't blur out some of the faces of sensitive individuals that the Taliban ended up using as a hit list, unfortunately. But I did get a chance to see that, and it was very powerful to see your exploits in person. Interesting that there was a choice to not put some of the subtitles for the Afghan sections, because I don't understand. I speak Spanish and English. I don't speak Afghani. But is it Arabic that they speak in Afghanistan, or what's the language there?
Speaking Pashto and Dari. Dari is another dialect of Persian.
Okay.
So two official languages.
Okay.
It's we use Arabic letters though.
Yes, and that's why it's sometimes for us we just meld them all together. It's Arabic, like it's not necessarily true, because my wife is Taiwanese, but she can also read Japanese. So like, wait, why? It's like, it's similar Chinese lettering. It's like, oh, okay, I get that part, but because I read your book, I knew what part of the story I was in. I'm like, that must be that part. And then when it played out, I'm like, man, that's crazy. The cameras were there to catch that. So I was able to piece those things together. But unfortunately, people won't be able to, at least the moment, be able to see Retrograde unless the filmmakers fix it for some reason. But they can definitely pick up your book, The Last Commander. I want the American people to understand this next part, though, because right now in political arguments, especially since we're up on an election as we're recording this, so Trump is seeking his re-election, and Biden has stepped away to make room for Kamala Harris. There's 3 different administrations that had in a way, policies that affected you. And I would like for you to summarize for us, because in your book, you really come out strong against Biden. And I find that very fascinating, because as in politics over here, yes, we saw what happened under the Biden administration, and some might chalk it up to just politics. But I want people to understand it wasn't just political optics. What exactly happened on the ground? So Obama's the one that announced the withdrawal and set a date. How did that change the military tactics with the Taliban?
So initially, when President Bush was in charge in 2001, the American troops came in. It was the Afghan resistance that took over the country. There was a handful of American special forces embedded with the Afghan resistance, and of course, with the robust U.S. air support. But all the ground, every province collapsed under the force of the Afghan resistance. The Taliban run away into Pakistan, most of them, but a lot of them were killed and arrested as well. After that, we started rebuilding our military, our police, our infrastructure, and the relationship between America and Afghanistan became very, very close. The two presidents, President Karzai in Kabul and President Bush in Washington, really got along very well. They talked to each other, they listened to each other, they listened to the soldiers, and they have provided everything that the soldiers needed to have in order to win the war, and also develop a strong ally for America in South Central Asia. When President Obama came, he was very upset with the way President Bush treated Afghanistan and treated our president, Hamid Karzai. He immediately picked up a fight with our president, and he didn't like our president. And at one point, President Obama and his team tried to overthrow President Karzai from his presidency. and they couldn't because President Karzai was very popular in Afghanistan. So he became the president, and he really then, he hated President Obama hated President Karzai. So then the relationship was very, very bad and ruined. And the U.S. requested to sign bilateral strategic agreement. President Karzai refused because he knew that President Obama's team was trying to overthrow him. So he asked, we need guarantees, and there were no guarantees. So President Obama then wanted to pull out all the troops and leave Afghanistan, but he wanted to do it gradually. That's when a lot of Afghanistan's neighbors, like Iran, Russia, and other countries, including Pakistan was already supporting the Taliban. They're like, oh, okay, the U.S. troops are leaving, so we better support the Afghan Taliban to topple the Afghan government, because if the U.S. troops leave and the Afghan government still remains here, this is a U.S. ally, and, we will not be able to do things in this region. And we were building a strong military. So that actually removed the deterrence posture, deterrence effect of the U.S. presence in Afghanistan, and then everybody knew that the U.S. was leaving. Well, that was not enough. Then President Obama went on and dug out some of the Taliban prisoners who were in Guantanamo Bay, and one of the key Taliban leaders who was in prison in Pakistan. He took them into Qatar, and he started negotiating with them about Afghanistan. At the time, the Taliban were very weak. They had no place in Afghanistan. They were doing irregular warfare and insurgency. And this gave them a political posture and, representation as well. And since then, the Taliban had fought stronger with the backing from our, neighboring countries, and also started growing into a more conventional military force. When President Trump came and the Doha Agreement was signed, this was signed without our consent, without our permission, without our participation. So the Afghan government was not party to anything that was signed. This was a unilateral American approach with the Taliban, and then Zalmay Khalilzad, Ambassador Khalilzad, who signed the agreement with Secretary Pompeo beside him, really, really killed the legitimacy of our government. And Afghan government was never seen the same. And then once the Taliban became, okay to talk to, then you had China, Russia, Germany, many other nations rush into talking the Taliban, Norway, and helping the Taliban in a way as well in terms of the negotiations. Towards the end of the presidency of President Trump, the situation got bad, and President Trump gave a green light to the military to restart preparations for joining the Afghan military against the Taliban. Unfortunately, he was, he didn't win the re-election, so he left office, and President Biden came. When President Biden came, we thought okay, he's a career politician. He knows the consequences of the fall of Afghanistan. Of course, he will remain. But unfortunately, he just immediately announced we're leaving without considering any consequences. And he said we're not bound by anything. And that started a series of events that culminated in the fall of our country, Afghanistan. Since the fall, our country was taken by terrorist organizations, but also America's reputation was strategically destroyed and damaged. America's access to the heart of Asia was cut off, and then the American rivals like Iran, North Korea, Russia, and China are very much emboldened. And then they saw President Biden as a weak leader, and they saw this move as America retreating from the global spheres, and then everyone started taking on their own, little agendas that they have. And if you measure the world today, the world is unsafe by every measure you want to measure it, from the economy to politics to war fighting to terrorism to conventional war to the threat of nuclear war. All of that started with the collapse of Afghanistan.
That's
and then as a domino effect on everything else that's happening in the world.
Yes, and I wholeheartedly agree with that, because we showed weakness instead of strength. And every time our president would say, don't, the enemy did, and did nothing. So it is a frustrating thing as an American citizen watching this whole thing play out. But I must emphasize for the audience, though, and we're running up on time, but I wanted to get this out there. The film Retrograde showed it. You talk about it in your book, because for Americans, all of us saw just the images being beamed from Kabul of a bunch of military-aged men scrambling to get out. You can't see the women, you can't see the children, but there's a bunch of men, and all of us are wondering, why are they not standing up to the Taliban? And to us, it was very frustrating to see that. And as I told you before we recorded, in learning a lot more, there's a very untold story there. And I'm so glad I got more perspective for why I wanted you to shed a little light on this one. Retrograding meant to destroy our technology and things and our equipment so it won't fall into the wrong hands. But our strategic partners, our allies, had no access to this. And instead of giving you our ammunition, because we're not bringing it, our troops were blowing them up. And
yeah,
okay. The excuse was they didn't want it to fall into the wrong hands. So how were you guys supposed to stop the wrong hands from getting it if you had no way to stop them?
That's right. Yeah.
You talk about having at least a couple of helicopters, there were Black Hawk helicopters and other equipment, but there were no parts to repair them. The software needed updating. Those licenses were removed. You were all trained to use proprietary programs from the United States government. And all that's taken away, and now everything's useless.
That's right. That's exactly what happened.
See,
it was not a stick fight. It was a stick we would use to.
Exactly, and that is what no one hears that story. Maybe they saw a little bit if they got to see Retrograde, but that was only on Disney Plus, Hulu, because National Geographic belongs to them. But when I learned that part, I'm like, wow, that changes everything that I thought. And as I told the one that runs the Last Commander Instagram, I said, in reading this book, learning so much was just so much insight that I was only able to get from an Afghan. And I wanted to share it and summarize it as quick as I possibly could because of the time we have. But I also wanted to say this to you. It didn't feel like The Last Commander. It felt like you were the only commander, honestly, having to drag an entire country and government on your back. I wish people could hear about your story a lot more. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get to it on this episode, but you are more than welcome to come back because there's so much to dig into this. But I want people to know that you are a patriotic public servant for your country. The government wanted to use you for political gain. You would not capitulate to them. That made you enemies, including this thing with the coffee pot, the coffee machine that happened with President Ghani that we didn't get to touch on. It's just there's so many elements to this onion that we can just peel just to see how much there was there. But I want people to understand that you or yourself are not out of the fight. You touched on the Afghanistan United Front, and it's a political movement. So let me ask you this to close it out for the audience: is this a political movement to democratically challenge the Taliban, or are we talking about it's something of violent, a revolution against the Taliban?
I like your eloquent way of putting it, democratically challenging the Taliban. I don't think we will challenge them very democratically. I think, unfortunately, war and violence is necessary to remove the Taliban because, unfortunately, they do not understand any other language. They don't they don't do negotiations, they don't talk. So you must go back and just remove them by force. And this is necessary. This is not what we want, but this is unfortunately what we have to do in order to free our people. Afghanistan United Front is set up for one purpose: to mobilize efforts to free our country from the Taliban. And that means we have to change the Taliban regime and bring in a new government and establish a new regime. And a new regime, we want this to be based on our constitution that was adopted in 2004. This is a constitution that protects the civic rights of men and women, minorities, religious groups, religious ideologies. Afghanistan is not exactly the same as the Taliban portray it is. Afghan people are freedom-loving people. We love our freedoms. We love our civic rights, and we want to have a prosperous life. We want to have open relationship with the rest of the world. We want to have education. We want to be able to travel around the world, and we want the world to come into Afghanistan, invest, spend time, do tourism. Afghanistan is a very good country, and for that we will fight again. And in our organization, all the cadres are patriot, capable politicians and generals, and everybody wants to fight for our people. We have taken a couple of strong steps. The first step was to establish a team of capable patriots. We have done that. The second step was to establish an organization which will allow us as a vehicle to do our mission. We did that. The third step was to gain legitimacy across the world, because war fighting requires legitimacy. We are within our rights to go back and fight the Taliban because they have occupied our country against the will of our people. And we want to go back and for the will of our people and bring back our constitution. And lastly, as we build our legitimacy, then the next step is to deploy on the ground and start freeing our country from the Taliban. It will take some time, as you mentioned at the beginning of our introduction. This is a steep hill, but no matter how high the hill is, how difficult the task is, we have given the rest of our life for this purpose, and we will fight for our country, because our people do not want the Taliban. They didn't accept the Taliban as their rulers, and they want to change, and we will fight for that change.
Yeah, and I would definitely love to hear more about your progress in a future episode. I just wanted to say this to you because I'm as Christian Orthodox as it comes, and I understand that you are of your Muslim faith and you're a practitioner of your faith. Am I correct in that assessment?
I am a Muslim, yes.
Okay. And I want to say this. If God did not have a purpose for you, you would not be here talking to me right now. There's absolutely no way you could have done what you did if you had not had divine providence watching over you. Your story is powerful. I hope that people pick up your book, The Last Commander, available on Amazon, possibly exclusively on Amazon for now, folks. But I'll be leaving links to that and the commander's Instagram and X also, where you can follow updates about him. And also, I think the Afghan United Front has its own social media. I'll find those plugins. I'll reach out to your social media guy to get the links. And they'll be included on the episode shown as accompany this episode at theandresegovia.com. General Sadat, it has been an absolute pleasure in speaking with you here on the Andre Segovia Show. You're welcome to come back anytime.
Thank you, Andreas, and I wish you all the very best with your shows.